This week you will read and hear about the controversy underlying the definitions of terrorism. After over a decade of a global war on terror, many take for granted that we know our enemy. But terrorism is not a people, but a tactic. And as it turns out, there's no objective definition for that tactic that is universally agreed upon. The United Nations has struggled with this issue for many, many years due to two primary stumbling blocks. First, some want to see violence perpetrated by states against civilian populations considered in definitions of terrorism. Second, some argue that a definition of terrorism should not override the right of people under foreign occupation to resist. Many Americans would dismiss the United Nations difficulties as irrelevant, since the United States is ostensibly leading the world in the fight against terrorism. As such, our definitions should be the ones that matter. Unfortunately, we don't have a single agreed upon definition either. The FBI has a different definition than the Department of Homeland Security, who has a different definition from the U.S. State Department, who has a different definition than the Department of Defense. Well, you get the idea. Should terrorism be defined by a specific type of act? For example, is violence required? Or just the threat? Is intent important? Are political goals a necessary requirement? What about targets? Must they be civilian? Or can military targets be victims of terrorism as well? What if the targets are not human at all, but property? Could bombing or burning an empty building be considered terrorism? How about hacking computers and/or disclosing classified information? If this all sounds like pure philosophy or just an academic exercise, it's not. How we define terrorism, and perhaps more importantly, how those definitions are applied, has very real consequences. On August 15, 2012, Floyd Lee Corkins shot a security guard at the Family Research Council in Washington, D.C. The guard was able to disarm and hold him until police arrived. Corkins confessed that he had intended to kill as many people as possible and had brought 15 Chick-fil-A sandwiches to smear on the faces of his victims as a political statement. He had chosen the Family Research Council, a conservative Christian organization, because of its views, including their opposition to gay marriage. In September 2013, he was sentenced to 25 years after pleading guilty to charges including a terrorism offense, the first conviction under Washington, D.C.'s 2002 Anti-Terrorism Act. Just a couple of weeks earlier, U.S. Army Major Nidal Malik Hassan was given the death penalty for opening fire at Fort Hood in Texas, killing 13 people and wounding 32 others in 2009. Despite having exchanged emails with radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki and confessing to having switched sides to wage jihad against what he believed was a U.S. war against Islam, Hassan was not convicted or even charged with terrorism. As a result, his victims were not eligible for Purple Hearts or other military benefits, with the incident instead labeled workplace violence. In April of 2015, the Obama administration reversed this decision and awarded the Purple Hearts. And most recently, on June 17, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the oldest black churches in the United States. And after sitting and participating in Bible study for nearly an hour, stood up and opened fire with a .45 handgun. When one of the churchgoers present asked why, he responded, "I have to do it. You rape our women and you're taking over our country. You have to go." When he fled the scene, 6 women and 2 men lay dead. A third man died later at the hospital. Roof's mass murder comes one day after an op-ed published in the New York Times titled "The Growing Right-Wing Terror Threat," describing research that shows how more Americans have been killed by violent right-wing extremists in America since 2002 than by Muslim extremists. On June 22nd, the director of the FBI, James Comey, stated, "Terrorism is an act of violence to try to influence a public body or citizenry, so it's more of a political act. And based on what I know so far, I don't see this as a political act." He continued to say that this doesn't make it any less horrific, the label, but terrorism has a definition under federal law. Shortly thereafter, Roof confessed to authorities that he intended to start a race war, and a manifesto was discovered online. 2 days later, the FBI and Department of Justice released statements indicating that domestic terrorism charges had not yet been ruled out. Critics argue that if Dylann Roof were Abdul Rauf and his motive was not race war, but holy war, that there would be no delay or debate in his being labeled and charged a terrorist. Some further contend that the term is so selectively applied that it is a meaningless propaganda term, used simply to discredit or demonize political opponents. Conventional wisdom states how one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, indicating that the same tactic that would be labeled as terrorism if employed by an enemy would be overlooked as a necessary evil at worst if used by an ally or ourselves. Austin Turk, in Sociology of Terrorism, explains how probably the most significant contribution of sociological thinking to our understanding of terrorism is the realization that it is a social construction. Contrary to the impression fostered by official incidence counts and media reports, terrorism is not a given in the real world, but is instead an interpretation of events and their presumed causes. And these interpretations are not unbiased attempts to depict truth, but rather conscious efforts to manipulate perceptions to promote certain interests at the expense of others. What do you think? Do we need better definitions of terrorism? Better applications of those definitions? Or is it sufficient to just assume that we know it when we see it?